Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Coming Together, a series on understanding the social dynamics of Singapore and facilitating dialogue on various topics from current affairs to social norms. This series is in collaboration with the Whitehatters.sg, a local NGO that seeks to foster greater understanding and integration between the communities in Singapore. My name is Rindo. And today's topic is about race, about racism, and why it's so hard to talk about in Singapore. Of course, this is a very sensitive topic and oftentimes a controversial one, but we are, of course, committed to talking about this with clarity, with nuance, and with fairness. And of course, in light of recent events, it's an important conversation worth having. So as part of this episode, today we are joined by three special guests. One is, of course, Suhaile, a fellow collaborator in the project, and he has appeared in previous episodes. So Suhaile is a freelance writer, former journalist. Hello, Suhaile.
Hi, Rindo. Thank you for having me again.
Nice to have you again. We also have Syafiqah Taufek, who is a graduate student at the NUS in the Department of Malay Studies, whose research interests include socio-religious issues and religious ideologies across the Southeast Asian region. Syafiqah, hello.
Hi, nice to be here.
And hopefully that was accurate?
Yes.
Okay, cool. And of course, we have a very special guest, Daniel Goh, who is the Associate Professor of Sociology at the NUS and has done research on race and multiculturalism, post-colonialism, the politics of history and identity, and the cultural politics of global city making. Daniel, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
Fun fact, Daniel, my wife took a couple of your classes when she was studying sociology in NUS. And yeah, she did say that you were one of the cooler professors. So.
Oh, thank you.
So, all right. Thanks, everyone, for joining this conversation. So I wanted to, we wanted to cover this topic because in light of recent events over the last couple of years, there has been a growing sense of discussions around race and racism. Of course, because of social media, we're seeing a lot more of it, both in terms of discussion and, of course, in terms of incidents of prejudice and, I dare say, hate. So I'm hoping that we can understand like how racism manifests itself in Singapore, and not just about like the various incidents which have been talked about at great length over, the last couple of years, but I was hoping we could understand like the boundaries and what are the challenges around talking about race and by extension racism. I have to qualify this by saying that I am a foreigner. And there are a lot of things that I'm perhaps not aware of when it comes to talking about race and racism. So, and this is quite important for me to understand in the sense that there's many aspects about growing up as a Singaporean or growing up in Singapore that is not visible to me. So I was hoping I could get some insight and, we could talk about this, especially in a country where there is a significant population of foreigners whose definition of racism may be radically different. So perhaps we could just start off with, a basic question, like the definition of racism in Singapore. Like, what does racism mean in the Singaporean context?
Maybe Prof can go first, and then I can.
You want me to start with a textbook definition?
Yes, the theory, the theory on racism first.
Well, I think I can kind of use a definition that's two parts. Right? The first part is one in which you're prejudiced against other races, even against your own race, and that could be considered in words, in images, and whatnot. right? So that's one form of racism. But I think a more serious form of racism will be discrimination. And this happens when certain actions are taken that causes disadvantage to another race, that causes harm and hurt. And not just emotional hurt by using words, for example, or images, but hurt in the sense of actual social, economic, and cultural detriment, right, to the persons and to the group. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that, Daniel.
Well, that's supposed to be a starter for a conversation.
So I did want to probably talk about this a little more, because when I was trying to read about this topic, which admittedly as a layman is quite difficult for me, because there's a lot of, for the lack of a better word, fancy words that I do struggle with. So there is conversations around what makes personal racism and what makes structural racism, and and of course there is the manifestation of racism, which can cover the spectrum of casual discrimination to ultra violence. So the reason why I'm just trying to have a better sense of this is because everything that I've been reading about race, racism, and racial discrimination is very much in the American context. Not to say that it doesn't inform my worldview and for me to try to apply it here in Singapore, but I often find that there are gaps and I make some logical mistakes by trying to transpose, those definitions and those discussions onto, racial issues here in Singapore. So I guess that's why I wanted to ask, what makes, how do we talk about racism in the Singaporean context? And is there a distinctive identity to the racism in Singapore?
I think, as you're sharing, right, Rindo, about the American discourse kind of thing, and as Prof himself was sharing about the difference from prejudice to discrimination, which is basically the manifestation of it, like there is an outcome, right? One difference that I just occurred to me is the idea of power itself was not expressly stated by Prof, right, in the idea of, it's implicit there that of course discrimination takes on a much more, I guess, has a greater effect the more power you have, as compared to the American definition that we are seeing now, and perhaps it's a British definition too, where power is it's a necessary element of the definition of racism. And from there, the idea comes about that a minority cannot be racist. So I think that's something that I did not hear growing up, right, in Singapore, where you could say like a minority could be told, hey, you're being racist by making a joke about the Chinese, or about the Malays if you happen to be Indian. But now, I'm hearing more online in Singapore, like minorities cannot be racist, and that personally does not sit well with me, right? And I think that's perhaps one avenue we can explore about how racism, we understand it in Singapore, might actually be different to the discourse we have. The example that always comes to my mind is, okay, so if you have a Chinese chauvinist in Singapore, right, he cannot stand Malays and Indians, right, this hypothetical Chinese man. He's a racist in Singapore because he is, he's part of the majority. But if he crosses the border to Malaysia, all of a sudden he's not racist because he's a minority there, or if he goes, takes a flight to Jakarta, he's suddenly not racist. I think that's where, likewise, a Malay chauvinist from Malaysia just crosses the border and all of a sudden he's not a racist in Singapore. I think that's where, the idea of what feels the definition should be among many Singaporeans does not quite gel with the more contemporary discourse that's coming in from the US. And yeah, so I actually prefer I think that itself unsettles quite a bit of the conversation we could be having in Singapore. Yeah, so just putting that out there.
Yeah. If I may add, I guess the qualifiers for what racism is in Singapore should be different from America or other countries, because essentially our histories are all different. And even though racism can be rooted in history, our histories are all different. So For example, in America, we know the white and black distinction has been there, rooted in history for so long, where black is not just another race, but also tied to slavery. But in Singapore, we have, it's different, right? Because we have three main races, for example, and then all of them has their own stereotypes, and these stereotypes have been, it's a discourse that was promoted by the colonials, and it sustained until today. So in a sense, like the way we also be racist to other people sometimes can be different. We don't look at like skin color per se. We don't call like someone being yellow or brown. We just talk about for example, Chinese having certain traits, or Indian falling into certain traits, or Malays the same thing as well. So that differ, and therefore the discourse also and the way we discuss it should differ. Yeah, so that's why I feel.
When you mentioned the color thing, right? I'm hearing brown now in Singapore.
Yeah, right.
We are brown people.
Right. That's what happened recently
Malay, Indian
too.
solidarity.
Yeah, but which is something new actually, because right. Yeah, because I don't think we ever heard of like brownness or like yellowness, because yellowness itself is like it's more like an American construct of a Chinese, but not like a Malay or Indian construct of what a Chinese is. Brownness suddenly, falls like it subsumes all the minorities, like Malays and Indians, and then pitted against the majority. I think that really colors the discussion even more and complicates it, and then it really like bring you away from how the history was like.
Right.
Yeah. So in that sense, I guess it's important to see like where this racism comes from and discuss it differently.
I do see colored descriptions in the colonial archives.
In some instances.
So in some ways, it is a Western ideology that attempts to whiten the white race even more, right? I mean, I still recall, when I was growing up as a kid, watching movies about apartheid in South Africa, and there was this film about Steve Biko, a murdered activist, anti-apartheid activist, and he stood up in court and he said, what makes me black? I'm not black. I'm actually more brown, right? And what makes you white? You're actually more pink than white, right? So his argument was that this coloration, right, is itself an ideological construct that was invented by the colonials as an attempt to kind of create a particular power play, right? And I think to transfer that into Singapore right now is to actually resurrect a certain kind of colonial ideology. Right, Daryl, for example, right, or the lazy brown man, right, the brown native, and then the blacks, and so on and so forth, the uncivilized savage black.
So it was a conscious decision to move away from color coding, so to speak. Okay, that's interesting. Wow.
Yeah, you start to talk reduction to skin color is damn dangerous. Chinese folks talk about, then you start to have like want to whiten their skin, for example, right, and that kind of stuff. I just want to bring in another important writer, Frantz Fanon, right, White Skin, Black Mask, right. It becomes it's a in our skin in those kind of on all of us to start looking in that kind of colored terms. Yeah.
Right. So Daniel, a quick question about skin color. I mean, of course, when it comes to racism, there's always a discussion about, differentiation by color of skin, but isn't like colorism its own thing? Because I mean, for context, like I'm from India, and like there is a lot of colorism that happens in the country, and discrimination with respect to it. There's the fair skin is seen as an aspirational ideal, and this predates like colonialism. So like while we can say that the racial categorization in Singapore has been a manifestation of imperialist ideology, so to speak, doesn't colorism also play a part in surface level discrimination?
It does. I mean, I think colorism is also used for, let's say, racial profiling, right? So you profile somebody based on their skin color, so that happens. But I would say that this colorism as a kind of predominant way to look at people is a colonial construct. It very much happened during the era of Western imperialism,
right, in
the 19th century, right, and expect much further as a concept in terms of its genealogy. It was about biology. It was about what where are the origins of humanity or humankind, right? And it goes back to the discovery of the Americas and the meeting of Native Americans, and Native people in South America, and what do we do with them? Are they human? And these are Catholics, right, or Christians who encounter them, right? Are these humans, or are these also children of God, or are they not, or are they animals and things like that? So race goes back to that particular genealogy, and it's not about color, skin color. It is about biology, right? It's about the essence of humanity, and that's why it can take essence of humanity, and that's why it can take on very complex kind of nuances and arguments, right? And it may not be about colorism, but colorism is a simplification and a reduction, and it's very may not be about colorism, but colorism is a simplification and a reduction, and it's very much linked to colonial ideology. Yeah.
So obviously, while the origins of race and racial categorization, the genealogy, as you put it, probably goes well before, let's say, the 17th or 16th centuries. I mean, I guess the modern taxonomy of race is now very much around looks, I would say.
And
Right.
culture also, I think. I think it has moved on. It has advanced in a way where, because I guess it's more taboo now to malign an entire group based on the color of their skin. So now they go for cultural deficit ideas, right? We saw that in Singapore during COVID, right? Most prominently about with our migrant workers, when I think it was the Chinese mainstream newspapers, right? We're talking about cultural deficit,
hygienic and all that.
Conveniently forgetting that the vast majority of people who clean up Singapore are the migrant workers, right? And there's just something very, very interesting there. Likewise, I mean, even the cultural deficit theories with the Malay community, right, in Singapore. So these are intimately linked to the older, the genealogy of, of the thing. In fact, I think Lee Kuan Yew himself also was a part of the era, right, where, Dr. Mahathir himself was part of that scientific racism era, where you are biologically inferior. Yeah. So it just manifests itself in different ways now.
Right. I mean, there was a time when this was considered scientific, right?
Well, I mean, it's still considered scientific now by a lot of people.
You still get this in sociology, and the idea of the culture of poverty, for example, among certain groups of people, get rid of certain kind of prejudices and biases.
Right. I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned the culture of poverty. I mean, I'm just going to make an assumption here and say that socioeconomic status also plays a big part in how, let's say, different communities are perceived, and over time, over generations, they just become entrenched as personality traits, so to speak.
Right, yeah. And the personality traits, they are linked to the so-called particular cultural traits, right? So traditions or whatnot. But I think the crucial thing is that the critique of these culture of poverty arguments is that look, there are structural racisms. And structural racisms is you don't have to really depend on actual racial prejudices of actual people, but it's because the social structure is for historical reasons, or for due to, let's say, to traditional kind of job sectors and whatnot, and the fact that migrant people congregate in certain kind of employment sectors and occupational sectors, it leads to a social structure in which race or active defining characteristics that divide the social income, the socio-economic income groups.
Yeah, I think we see that in Singapore, especially after independence, right? When we were developing, and then we happen to have certain racial groups to be very backward. But are they backward because they are culturally backward? It's not. It's because of all these socioeconomic factors that Prof has mentioned. Yeah. But then, even if that is the case, the racial ideas on these communities still persist until today. And it did shape the policies that we had before that to tackle the underdevelopment.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I can see that actually worsening over the next few decades, even if our policies persist. I mean, let's just call it out, the elephant in the room, right? We're talking about the Malay community specifically, and I bring that up because I think I mentioned to Rindo before, perhaps on a previous podcast, about our immigration policies, right? And if you compare that with the birth rates, now I've not done the math.
Yeah.
I can't do the statistics. I'm learning, but right now, I mean, we have our birth rates at the various communities, like the Indian community, the Chinese and the Malay community. Now, the Chinese and the Indians, their birth rates, if I recall correctly, were already below replacement level from the 1980s, right? And the Malays, I think it's only recently that it started to dip below replacement level. Now, yet our population, our resident population in 1990, if I recall, was 2.5 million. Right now, our resident population is 4 million, right? And we know that the vast majority of our migrants, new citizens, are either Indians or Chinese due to politics, due to historical reasons. So the bulk of the new migrants, new citizens, are Chinese and the Indians who are supplementing that shortfall. Now, don't forget that the way we select for these citizens are completely based on economic levels, right? Those who are of the lower economic strata, they are our migrant workers. They are barred systematically from ever becoming citizens.
Yes.
Right? From procreating, from setting up a family, the short-term 2-year thing. So what you have here is a further entrenching of the socioeconomic status of the other of the Malays and the Chinese and the Indians, right? So I think for a long time now, Singapore, we have not been able to talk about the intersection of class and race. It's a very sensitive thing, and the situation is just getting worse because right now it's becoming even more Malay simply because of the way the policies are, right? At least that's how I'm seeing it in the future, and I think it's tragic that we still can't talk about it after 40 years of independence. So I think that's a serious issue that no one's raising publicly in public discourse. I mean, I'm not sure about academia.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not going to lie, Suhail. I struggle with understanding intersectionality. Like it's
fine.
like one of those words that I think I know what it means, but then I try to read up on it, and then it just gets more complex the more you get into it. So
I think people who talk about intersectionalities probably don't understand it either. For the longest time, they talk about it as one on top of another, and then you have an Operation Olympics about I'm 5 minorities, so I'm 5 times worse off than you. No, I don't think that's how it works. Sorry, Prof. I think you'd be best placed to explain it.
No, I think the problem with intersectionality is that it's been really discussed and also talked about, defined in terms of identity. Whereas what we are talking about in terms of race and the intersection, right, and its interaction with class. We're talking about social structure. We're talking about systems and how they privilege or underprivilege certain groups. And this is the interesting part, right? Because the recent discussions about race are really about identity, about casual racism, about symbolic racism, to really identify in terms of what when we're talking about economic advantage, right, of the Chinese. What gives the Chinese or the Indians the economic advantage over, let's say, the Malays in Singapore? Instead, people are skirting around it, talking about prejudices, which is something that they can deal with in a very casual way around it, right? And basically avoiding the issues of structural racism, which I think is the more important issue to be discussed.
I think part of the problem is because the entire discourse is very middle class driven, isn't it? I mean, when you're economically comfortable, you can only focus on your skin color, right? Which is why you didn't hear so much of the noise, or at least I didn't hear much noise about the PMD issue. Even though it disproportionately affects the Malay community when PMD was banned, right? None of the usual very vocal race discussants online even made that connection. So that's like proof, you don't want to check your own privilege on class.
So
maybe that's why the discussion isn't progressing.
I have a question here. So obviously, Chinese privilege has become quite a loaded term. I think ever since it was first coined way back in 2013, I want to say, when Sangeeta Thanapal, I believe, kind of used like white privilege as an analogy, to build on top of. So there has been a lot of resistance, and I've had conversations, with my Chinese friends who also struggle with what privilege means. And oftentimes the conversation is like, I don't feel this privilege, so why is this other person screaming at me, asking me to check my privilege? So, and I know these guys, they're not like, bigots or chauvinists, but I think they are struggling with that,
Right.
In their eyes, aggression.
Yes.
So, like, why does there seem to be a resistance to this term Chinese privilege? And by extension, does this exist?
Well, I think part of it is, okay, there are a few issues here, right? One of it is the whole, because I remember watching this unfold in real time when Sangita Tanapal, I was fresh out of NS. Then all of a sudden I came across this online sphere of a lot of angst and anger about racism, which resonated with me because it resonates with my own experiences of racism in Singapore. But somehow it was just a bit more. For me, it was toxic, right? Even at that stage, it's at some point it is cathartic, but beyond that, and it came to a point where even when you bring it up, like, hey, you know what? Maybe we could be a bit more constructive after we have had our cathartic experience, and you get shut down for it. And in that discourse, I realized there's a difficulty in unpacking the universal from the particular, right? So the universal being like, as a group, the Chinese have advantages that the others don't, right? But people conflate it as if you are personally responsible for the advantages that your group has. And that sort of, it's hard to deal with that because you're saying, wait, I'm a decent guy, right? I'm not a bad person. But because of that conflation there, and because that anger also is not, separated, a lot of things get conflated and, emotions get high. And you end up with things like the Tapao Forum where Minister Shanmugam was surprised, right? So I think there's a lot of conflation there on mainly just the universal and particular, and, just whack on it.
Right. And I think privilege as a word has also, it means a lot of things, but also like privilege has it has a regal meaning, right? And so because a lot of folks don't identify with that sense of like almost obvious, tangible sense of privilege, they struggle with it. And I think I've seen conversations online where it's like, if only we could replace the word privilege with something like advantage or something like majoritarianism, I think conversation, like, they'd say that the conversations would have flown easier. Do you feel that this would be the case if we, called it by any other name?
I think calling it by other names can give different nuances. Because privilege, it's adopted from the West, right? White privilege. In America, I think they list down like a few things that can qualify you as having these privileges. But the question is, can we do the same thing here? Because if we can't, then we can't really adopt that to Singapore. Right? Because, for example, in the White, have you been stopped by a petrol police car? Those kind of things. But here, it's very different. So we can actually talk about some kind of privilege or advantage, because in real life we can see examples, but whether or not it's racism. So if, for example, we want to talk about NS, there are certain vocations in NS that are it's being filled by a certain race as compared to others. The question is it because they favor one race or another? Or is it because it's just by merit? It just happened that this group of people happen to be like the best, the top 10, the top 3% of people who can qualify to be in that vocation. So, we do see things so-called like seemingly like racism happening or seemingly like privileges happening. But of course, we have to probe further and see what are the logic behind those things. I don't think we can just whack and say that, oh, this is privilege, because we don't see that happening in all areas. If we do see that happening in every sector, every areas, workplaces, school, education and all that, then maybe yeah, but we don't see that, right? We only see that in certain areas but not all.
I see. Having said this, though, and I want to, go back to, I mean, there was this seminar done by academia.sg early this year. It was called Regarding Racism. It was a really good seminar by a bunch of academicians, one of whom who is Imran Taib. And this was in the aftermath of the Tanbu Udli incident. And so I think there was a conversation about, talking about racism. And I think one thing that I noted from that discussion was that because there hasn't been a nuanced conversation about race and racism in Singapore for the longest time, because people need to talk about it, they find a certain resonance with, conversations happening elsewhere. And because America, from, the very nature of their society, in my opinion, I feel it's a very activist-driven culture. And just like India, also a lot of this activism happens from the ground up. And they kind of invent terms, so to speak, which, the rest of the world then ends up using because our own societies haven't, evolved to that point, if you will. Evolved is probably not the right word, but, gotten there. So at least from what I'm seeing here, I am sensing a certain discomfort when it comes to talking about race here in Singapore, which is why there seems to be a lot of adoption of, terms that we consider foreign import or whatever. So I appreciate that there is now a language to, talk about race, racial discourse, etc. And I'm seeing like it goes both ways, right? On the one hand, there are a whole bunch of people who are inspired, by movements overseas, like, Black Lives Matter comes to mind. And then on the other side of the coin, there are people who, adopt, talking points from the American far right to refute these movements. So it seems to go both ways, right? So every time when I hear conversations about, oh, this is Western ideology, we shouldn't, accept it, those folks are inadvertently using, far right ideology, so to speak, to just talk about this. So is there a way for us to talk about racism within the Singapore context that is specific to Singapore so that this question of Western ideology import does not arise at all?
I think
Well, yeah, go ahead.
I think at the end of the day, the problem with the adoption is that we should not be averse to the West or to the concepts in the West. We can be inspired by them, but of course, at the end of the day, what matters is localizing it, and see whether it fits. So, like I think we've mentioned before this, like there's different kind of manifestations of racism, and how it has come to this point also differ from other countries to Singapore. So as much as we do adopt like other languages, we also have to look back at why this is happening in our own country. And I think that's when the discourse should expand to talking about, like, partly it's like history also. Some part of it is not being talked about in education. When we talk about colonialism, for example, we talk about how, okay, they get the Chinese and Indians here, and then we all have our own roles. But then that itself is racism. And I think we should start from there. How these stereotypes develop is actually from them. And I don't recall studying about this in school. So we can start there, understand the history of racism first. And then from there, I guess we can see how it has manifested in the structures, if there is, in today's world. So yeah, we need to do that kind of process rather than just adopting and then applying it here, because contexts definitely differ.
Well, I think the problem is that for the longest, like, the holding line, right, which is the multiracialism, right, which is the multiracialism. Any issue that was used with regards to racism or prejudice or discrimination, we settle in a back room. I mean, that was essentially the scolding that essentially the MP Muhammad Faisal, hey, we do this. I think that is backdoor. We don't bring it out into the open, right? And that has been the norm for the longest time. And the norm is understandable historically, and and which led to the separation, of Singapore from Malaysia as a country, so that is very traumatic as collective trauma. The collective trauma is 73, right? So for my generation onwards, we forget the trauma, but for my parents, their trauma is real. I think I'm positive about this. We are developing our discourse. We are taking what's from the West, what's from Australia, even what's from anywhere else, from India or maybe China too, painfully, and that's the reason why some of us started intellectualhistory.sg, is to try to recover those what and writings and thoughts of our voices and how they talk about our pioneer generation. I think it's important to kind of they thought about these things, and we also add in their voices because they're not around anymore.
Wow, I'm a big fan of memory projects, Daniel. The site is called intellectualhistory.sg, yeah? Okay, I'll definitely have a look. Oh, wow, okay. No, that was actually an interesting viewpoint, I guess. I mean, quite typical of people my generation, I guess. I tend to forget the voices of the older generation. But then I think I was watching the recent talk on Today, tackling racism, and I think some of the things that they talk about is that there's, of course, they talk about this divide between the older generation and the younger generation also, but is this historical trauma the overarching reason for this difference, or is there I mean, look, and this is probably just anecdotal at this point, but I do find that the older generation tends to lean on stereotypes a little more than, let's say, people my generation. So I'm just trying to understand if, there is a generation issue there, but is it an old versus new thing? Because I'm also starting to see that stereotyping is being applied all across the board, and myself included. I make stereotypical decisions all the time. So I'm just trying to understand if, is it really an old versus new thing, or is it a problem of, lazy intellect?
I think the generation do matter. This is what I see also in my family, where the older ones tend to be more stereotypical of others.
That's right.
And we can't invalidate that because that's probably what they went through. They saw the riots. They also live communally, and then they develop certain ideas about other people. So for them, what stereotypes they think of others is really true, even though for us it's not, that's not the case. So it can be generational as well because they live communally. But then now, our generation, we no longer have what do you call that, schools just like a Malay school and all that, right? Our schools are more integrated. Our housing is more integrated. So in a sense, we are being more exposed to seeing different faces every day at least, as compared to the previous generation. Yeah. So it can be a generational thing.
Just to add on to Syafiqah's point, I think another generational difference that I was only just realized I was blind to is that my conception of living in Singapore is defined by Singapore's borders, right? The current borders, but that was not necessarily the case for the older generation. For one, it was Malayan, right? It was one contiguous body. I mean, I think it was S. Rajaratnam, even months or years after independence, he still thought he was Malayan, and that imagination extends to not just Malaysia, but also to Indonesia. And I mean, the Chinese, the way they're treated there is significantly worse, right? And I think that violence that the Chinese community faced from there, in spite of being there for generations, I think it's part of the cultural memory of the older Chinese, which is totally absent from my generation, even the Chinese kids of my generation, right, that I've spoken to. So when I hear the anger, some of the Sabah forum, we don't know who said what, but one of the things was what if we flex and our majoritarian status, have the minorities thought of that? And the moment I heard that, I was thinking, okay, he's not talking about our generation thing. I think it's something else that came in. He was probably thinking of the wider Southeast Asia. And I think a lot of us don't realize that. Definitely not my generation.
They also experienced 1964. The riots. It's in Kuala Lumpur.
I
New
see.
people who were involved in the 1969 riot and during the Suharto takeover and so on and so forth. So new people who were involved in the 1969 riot. The thing is, it's more people, and not to mention the other kind of all these you're not in Singapore because the there were and relative networks and so on and so forth. These groups of people and for that generation, yeah.
So sometimes I wonder, like maybe we don't think, like my sense of the minority community in Singapore is the Malays and the Indians, right? But I imagine someone of the older generation, even though he or she is part of the majority in Singapore, they feel viscerally a minority in the region. So there's a clash of imaginations here that you just have to address. And I think that's and that generation, by the way, they're still in power, yeah. Okay, we are not talking about retired and gonna die soon kind of thing, to put it very bluntly, right? Yeah. So I think that's something that needs to be addressed, and that generation teaches the next generation along the stereotypes and everything. So I think that's a critical area we have not addressed in our public discourse.
Right. I think there was a paper written by, or a book, I think it was written by Stephen Barr, I think that was his name, where he talked about how Singapore's multiculturalism is a response to, one, the institutional policies in Malaysia vis-a-vis Bumiputra, and of course, the pogroms in Indonesia against Chinese people. So the multiculturalism in Singapore was the conscious decision to establish a safe haven for everyone and look beyond race simply because, of what was happening in the larger region. So that was such an interesting take, because for me, I guess, coming from where I do, which is, I wouldn't say monocultural, but, in a lot of ways, we do kind of think of ourselves as a single whole versus, let's say, in a multiracial society. So I found that quite interesting. But then I'm also wondering if that definition has outlived its generation, because I think the modern conception of multiculturalism is quite different, I would say.
I think there are attempts to kind of layer. So it's kind of Singaporean way of doing things, right? Like our education system, we don't get rid of one thing, we just layer upon it, and then the stress just builds up, right? so at one point, I think the government announced, okay, so we are not quite just multiracial anymore. It's just not CMIO anymore, right? It's not Chinese, Malay, Indian, and others. We have a lot of new people coming in, new cultures coming in, new migrants who are becoming Singaporeans. So we have to be more multicultural. So I think it's a layering. Right, so the multiracialism is still very much at the bedrock, at the foundation, and then we have that layer of multiculturalism in which we are all called to be more cosmopolitan, to be more outward-looking, more global. But of course, that brings us back to the question of class, right? So who can be a cosmopolitan and who can afford to be one, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Cosmopolitan thing was a very Goh Chok Tong era kind of discourse, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Cosmopolitan versus heartland. Yeah. Yeah.
And on that topic, I'm just really curious, about the whole CMIO framework, which is, talked about a lot nowadays, and especially given, and I think in the recent talk on racism, there was a conversation about how you now have, double barrel, racial categories, and, a growing population that's just not just Singaporean, but from across the world. So, is there a need for CMIO anymore? Like, is there how do I put this? Can Singapore move towards a post-race society, or does it need to be?
Well, I think the better question is whether Singapore wants to. I think that's a more potent question. It's so much of Singapore is just structured around CMIO. Right, like everything, just the immigration policy I talked about earlier, right? And even the various shades of Indians that we have in the I category, right? There's so much tension within the I category, because you don't just have class, but you also have now caste issues emerging. I'm not Indian. I don't identify as Indian. I'm Bengali, Bangladeshi of origin, but because Bangladesh is overwhelmingly Muslim. So after many centuries, the caste issue is not as strong, right? So it was foreign to me until I spoke to Indian friends who are facing this issue of caste from newer Indians. The consciousness, right? It's not an issue I'm very aware of, but the main point is that this I category itself, it's so varied, right? So diverse, yet we still force feed into it. Likewise for the C, the Chinese category, you know. So no, I don't think Singapore wants to get past that. That's my sense of it. Yeah. By Singapore, I mean the
Right.
institutions, right? I'm not talking about the citizens. Yeah.
Yeah. I think CMIO manifests in our policies so much that if we want to do away with it, then what is the way forward? Housing policies, for example. If we do away with like CMIO, the question is then how can you ensure that in an estate that you can have different people living together? Because I think that remains important. Yeah, so of course, we can always do it away with it, but we have to always think about what's next and how to tackle the same issue in a different way. Yeah, so in that sense, it's difficult.
Yeah,
Nice.
Shafiqah, I think Shafiqah, I'm glad you brought up that example because this has been used as an example of structural racism, right? That the housing, the ethnic integration policy, because it disadvantages the minority sellers. Yeah. But the counter argument is that, actually a lot of the minorities who applied for certain BTOs in areas in which the value is much higher will actually get an advantage because they actually allotted, a certain percentage. But whatever it is, I mean, the issue here is this. We've seen around the world, and there's actually actual studies in Singapore on the Singapore resale market, that ethnic groups tend to congregate together in the urban areas. They tend to want to buy and live among each other, right? It's in some ways a social fact, right? That has to be further explained, but it is a social fact, right? And what it means is that ethnic ghettos tend to form if cities allow a kind of free market situation. And when that happens, it means that you will have more Malay estate, a more Indian estate, a more Chinese estate. And because of the class differences in terms of the wealth distribution, it will mean that the estates that are more Chinese and a Chinese enclave, right, and then a Malay enclave, a Chinese enclave would be a lot more expensive, and the housing value will be a lot higher compared to a Malay enclave. So we're not just going to get the lack of integration in the housing sector, but we're going to get enclaves in which there will be visible class differences and wealth differences. And that is a recipe for disaster, in my view, for any kind of multicultural urban setting.
I actually tend to agree. I mean,
I
like the
see.
EIP is something I generally like. I don't have issues with it in principle, right? Although yes, I do feel that the minorities get the short end of the stick by virtue of the fact that they're a smaller group, right? In certain ways, because I mean, the fact that you're 75% of the majority, no matter where you go, you have your own enclave to a certain degree, right? And like when you do walk around private estates, you see the stark difference. Um, so I spent
Yeah.
part of my youth in Taman Jurong, which is more of we were renting there for a while because we were migrants. And the nature in Taman Jurong, which the MP is Taman Shanmugaratnam, which always makes me laugh. I love it. He did a lot of good work there, by the way. I really appreciate that. I spent a few years there, and then I moved to my current place in Jurong West. So my family did, and you can see the difference, right? So I imagine if it's left to the free market, it'll be way worse, right? And I think can even
Yeah.
what little social mobility we have, especially around schools, I think that will drastically change, right? So yeah, so that's one of the things where I think pragmatism has to rule in that sense. Yeah.
I see. I know I can understand the sensibilities of having these discussions around to prevent ghettoization and stuff, and of course for the government to be cognizant and understand like the various groups and categories. But on the flip side, sometimes I get annoyed. Like I think this was a couple of years ago. I was signing up for McDelivery on McDonald's, and then they asked for like name, surname, and then my race, which is a mandatory field. So I'm like, how is that important
Yeah.
to me ordering a burger? You know?
Right.
So, so of course I did reach out to them. I sent feedback to them saying that, hey, is this important? And then of course the response was that, oh, sorry about that. It was because it was like inherited from a paper form, from back then.
Yeah.
And so it kind of to me highlighted the fact that, oh, right. So race has become such a key part of literally everything that it's just a normal question to ask.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? We racialize issues that don't necessarily. I think sometimes the race lens itself blinds us to a lot of other things.
Yeah, it's also a kind of bureaucratic habit to kind of collect such information, which is pointless.
I mean, so I work in IT, and so I think we've been very conscious of personal data protection and stuff since 2013 and stuff. So I think I have seen a positive change in that only data that is relevant to the service that's being provided is being asked nowadays. So I think that's a good change in my opinion. Not because of the race thing, but more from a I only want to give you information that is relevant for you to give me, provide me the service. So so it is changing. So that's good. And I think this is an interesting topic to explore a little more on, because this is about the contemporary discussions on race. So obviously the ethnic integration policy highlights the need for a government to understand racial categories and understand these class and race differences so that they can make better decisions. But how would it work on the ground level? So I often struggle with talking about race with friends, with acquaintances, and I do feel like there has to be a way for us to talk about race and racial issues effectively and without, inviting anger or aggression or, being defensive, etc.
So the question is how we can talk better about it, or?
Yeah, like, I mean, are there ways for, the average layperson like myself to talk about race in a way that doesn't make the other person feel defensive?
Well, make sure you're good friends first. So,
Well, I think everyone has a part to play. We don't have to have big dreams of changing the situation, but for me, I think we can always start small with our own family members. I think instances of racism or just like saying certain things about other races are quite common, even within my family. So when I hear that, I would just call them out, saying like, no, that's not the case. Like, come on, you are being racist. Don't do that. Those kind of things. And I think we do have to have difficult conversations with some people. Like, don't shy away from the topic at all. Like, do talk about it. About racism. If someone is really curious, for example, about you and your race, be open and talk about it. Don't be defensive. I mean, because someone's concern, even though it might seem a bit racist, can be like a valid concern to them. Yeah. So for example, when they want to ask about, why do Malays do this or Malays do that? Don't be defensive. Just like tell them about it, like enlighten them. Yeah, I think the most important part is like when you see someone being racist, just call them out. But of course, when you call them out, also, firstly, be kind, especially when they are like your family or friends. Don't just jump and be that, don't give all the angst that you have. Just call them, just talk to them about it nicely. Yeah, that's for me is like the smallest thing you can do as a person on the ground. Yeah. Today, of course, if you see things like this in public, the easiest thing people do is calling out via videos, right? On one hand, I feel it's necessary, but on the other hand, also sometimes it's unnecessary. If you can just go to the person and say something, you just do that. You don't have to record and then viral the person and then like, make the person after that feel bad. We also don't want to be tackle racism with something that's very harsh, and worse, tackle racism with racism. Which I think is also common these days.
I think racism is fundamentally an idea, right? It's a very bad idea. It comes from a bad idea about race and their essence and their stereotypes. So I think we should fight bad ideas with good ideas. and don't get too personal and attack the person. And I think that's the good faith that we should enter into in any conversation. I remember when I came back from finishing up my PhD and coming back to NUS to teach in 2006. I started teaching race and ethnic relations, the module on race and ethnic relations, and it was so dangerous, because everyone was like saying, "Oh, it's a sensitive topic. You better be careful." I went into class with all my newfangled post-colonial theory and so on and so forth, and I was trying to deconstruct all the different stereotypes, and people were getting very uncomfortable. But I told them, look, we're going to enter into this module with good faith, that we are going to discuss difficult questions in a safe and secure environment, and we do not accuse anyone of being racist, right? But we attack the ideas. And if the ideas are racist, we unpack the ideas, and we'll be ready to to remove those ideas if we believe that they are bad and they are racist. I think that's the key thing, to kind of separate the ideas from the person, so that we can tackle and educate. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, I think what Prof said was important, which is safe space. We need to have safe space to talk about things. Some people, I feel you don't have to engage with them when they are very adamant and conscious about being racist.
Yeah,
but other people, we can engage with them, but we also need safe space. We all have ideas about other people, and we have to acknowledge that we also can be racist. But then we also need a space where we can trust others and just talk about it, because essentially that doesn't represent us. It represents what we have grown up with, and ideas that we have probably taken or influenced by other people. Yeah.
I think the other challenge I've had with talking about race, I think a lot of times we have flattened people's identities. What do I mean by that? For example, when someone says something racist, that's all we focus on. Which is understandable, right? But you tend to forget that that person is not just someone with just racist ideas, right? That person is a lot more complex than that. And it's an idea that I guess quite a few people may not agree with, or to use that language, if you feel like a certain race is your oppressor, something I don't agree with, but let's say you feel that way, then you humanize your oppressor. If not, you can't move forward with that, right? I mean, for example, right, you can have a very loving father, like he'll die for his daughter, he'll go for torture, like he'll go through hell for his daughter, but at the same time, he can still be a misogynist, right? But that does not negate his love for the daughter. So how do you unpack things like that? Likewise, if my friend, have some very racist ideas, but for some reason, because we are friends, I am that one asterisk, like, oh, this guy is fine, right? But all the others in his race are like that. I think that's an opportunity to talk. Like, that the person at heart is decent. So, like Prof said, you deal with the idea. On the flip side, I've realized that, or at least that's my interpretation. One of it is that I think the idea of being multiracial, or being committed to racial harmony, has sort of become part of the Singapore identity. And because the majority do not face racism in Singapore, generally speaking, right? Isolated incidences aside, like let's say if you're the only Chinese kid in the Malay soccer team, those anomalies aside, right? Because they have not faced racism, the idea of Singapore being multiracial, I'm seeing is part of their identity. So when you say that there is racism in Singapore, it's not just an idea. It's they feel attacked at their identity. Their Singaporeanness is at stake, right? And they don't realize it, and we don't realize it when we talk about it. So I think that's something that needs to be unpacked also, and it's not being talked about in our discussions because we don't see it. Plus, I mean, the Singapore identity is still forming. It's very amorphous, and it's not settled yet. But multiracialism, meritocracy, these are central to it. And race discourse tackles both, it's central to both, right? Meritocracy is not always meritocratic for the Malay kid or the Indian kid, right? But multiracialism is it's not really multiracialism for the kid who faces racism. So there is a contrasting, understanding of what Singaporean means, and this identity thing needs to be addressed. But it's hard, right? So just recognize that the other person is human. Plus, like Syafiqah said, you also got to pick your battles, the apek down the road voice, calls you a punde every time you walk around.
Yeah,
fine,
Right.
let the man have his kopi, just, he's not going to get up, he's not falling around, just leave him be, you don't need to, put him on
As
social
long
media.
as he's not
What
in
good is
a
that
situation of
gonna
power.
be,
lah. Yeah. Make sure he don't become a state district
Yeah, as long as he's not in a
ambassador,
situation of power, right? Yes, exactly, right? So if he's just there, retired, okay, let him be,
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
Interesting. I mean, I will be honest. I think I struggle with this mostly because, once again, foreigner. So a lot of this was invisible to me, but simply by nature of being Indian, in a lot of context, I am kind of, at least presumed to be part of the local minority until I open my mouth, of course. So, in many situations, of course, I'm having a chat with the taxi uncle, for example, and then he would chat. And then, of course, there would be the inevitable, statement, I'm not racist, but... And so, just like you said, you pick your battles, and I'm generally quite, forgiving of this kind of situation. But when it happens time and again, I think like stress builds up, and I'm like, okay, I know, as Shafiqah pointed out, there must be a way to call this out, but I'm also conscious of the fact that, there'll be stress and energy expended in trying to deal with this, and I'm not sure if it will be productive at the end of it, because I'm not sure if that guy is going to walk away from this conversation saying that, oh, he's right, I should change my ways. So, and in a lot of ways, this kind of criticism also, faces a resistance from a lot of folks, because it is like, Suhaile was saying, it's like an attack on your identity, or even on a higher level attack on your intellect and the power of reasoning, right? Because if somebody says that you're wrong, what that other person is essentially saying is that my way of logically looking at the world is somehow wrong, which is absolutely not true. So you kind of double down. So, and that's why I feel like, discussions about racism, I avoid completely. It's like when I hear this, I'm like, yeah, whatever, sometimes I've also been guilty of just kind of silently acquiescing to it. So I just silently agree just so that the conversation can be done and we can move on to other things. So I do realize that I shouldn't do this, but it can be super difficult to call out such instances.
I think that's part of the difficulty in calling out also is language. A lot of our understanding, or at least me and my friends' understanding of race, and you see that in the discourse online, it hinges a lot on the academic language, or the concept Chinese privilege, right? It's an academic, privilege is an academic term, right? So things like that, there's quite a bit of translation that's required to make it into laypersons, but that itself requires intellectual work, which itself is another level of altogether. So I think that's also part of the problem, and also especially if you're a minority, you have all these angsty feelings from you've suppressed it for don't know how many years, and then sometimes that just bubbles to the surface. It gets triggered, right? So we got to exorcise our own demons also before we can engage in it, especially in public discourse, right? So I think that's the other element there.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, because I struggle with trying to read all this and understand these terms, and I wish there were a simpler way. And I can see why, thinking along stereotypes is easier, because it's, I don't know, I guess stereotypes have a way of expressing themselves in simple terms, and, you find yourself just falling into the easier way of describing things. It's like, it makes sense of the world in just 3 sentences versus, something like talking about racial discourse, which has...
I think that's how our brains are wired, right? It's a survival thing.
I wish there was a simple...
don't walk down the dark alley. That's the stereotype,
yeah.
right? Don't walk down the dark alley because that guy is bigger than you. He may be the sweetest person ever, but your instincts go, maybe not, maybe not tonight. I'll try it another day. So a part of it is really trying to go against human nature.
I mean, I just wish at the end of all of this there was a simpler way to describe intersectionality. I'm not sure I got it. So, but that aside, I think I do feel like we have covered a fair bit of ground, especially around the discussion of racism, which I feel is very important. Is there anything that you all would like to add? Perhaps something that we may have missed out on, or something that's worth, talking about?
Yeah, I think for me, it's about how do you tackle racism altogether. I think, as we mentioned already, like on one hand is to discuss about it, acknowledging it happened and that we are also racist, and then yeah, have like safe spaces to discuss these matters. But I don't think that is sufficient. Of course, you need to have other calls of actions as well. I think sometimes if we segregate ourselves too much according to our racial categories, that can be very constricting. And we might overlook issues that all of us might have faced, right, together. So I think one way to conduct discussions is to just have a topic that we all probably resonate with together. So so for example, if we even talk about mental health, I'm sure everyone also face mental health issues. And from there, we can create new out groups and in groups as compared to just like racial categories. Because I'm sure a person like my age doing, for example, masters or from a different race will have similar concerns as compared to just me and being a Malay or someone else. Yeah, so I think these are the kind of discussions that need to take place, not just by NGOs, but I think in schools also. Like racial harmony, they can be expanded to having these kind of conversations in class rather than just like wearing each other's costumes, right? Which I think is missing totally in the discourse lah. Yeah, and extend it to workplaces as well, because I'm sure there are many instances of people like saying how like the bosses favor certain races and all that. This also should be included in workspaces. But of course, like it needs like it needs something to be initiated by probably the government when it comes to workspaces, because you can't just have like someone among the colleagues to have it. Sometimes it can be difficult, right? Because of the power as well. Yeah, so this kind of discussion must take place not just like in one session, so just one conference about social cohesion. It's very superficial. So we have to have these discussions like quite more frequently as well. Yeah, so on one hand, talk about the racism issue, but on the other hand, also talk about the similarities and concerns that we all face together.
I think I'll add two things.
Thanks, Syafiqah.
One of it is I think our discourse needs to move beyond lived experiences. Right now, it's been folk for years, man. It's been too. Okay lah, I get it lah. Every other motherfucker got a story lah. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be. I don't mean to be vulgar, but
No worries.
It's life. Which is not to invalidate the real experiences, but I'm saying we got to move beyond that, right? Like that's the first step. It's an important step, right? It's critical, but we have to move beyond that, which means making sense of it, right? Which means also doing work internally, not just externally, at a personal level. That's one. The other thing I want to talk about is I think Prof alluded to it earlier when you're saying that discourse is happening right now, is developing, and I think that's great, right? Just one warning, I guess, or something I'm a bit wary about. Our entire discourse on race is a bit too captive to the West, specifically American discourse, because of various reasons: cultural hegemony, whatever you want to talk about, social media, language of social media, right? Specifically the English one. Our discussions in Malay are more influenced by the North, right? Online Malay media. And the discussions they have are separate, right?
Right.
And you don't see any of the race activists talking about race issues in Malay, right? At least not that I've heard of, right? Likewise for the vernacular languages or in the Indian languages, right? Mandarin was only recently because, they were at the Chinese privilege, it was the heart of it. So there are actually three different discourses happening, or three different discursive spaces, right? The Chinese one is very influenced by China, right? Which is why the very anti-Western, anti-American US media nonsense, it is there, right? So the Mandarin speak. So we have like three different discursive spheres, and I only have access to one, English, because I'm not fluent in Mandarin or any of the Malay language or the Indian languages in Singapore. So that's the other thing. But the English one is very, very captive to the West. What do I mean by that, right? But a captive is actually I'm sure Prof and Syafiqah knows. I'm referring to specifically this concept by Prof. Syed Hussein Alatas, right? He was one of our preeminent scholars. He was the founder of the Malay Studies department in NUS. It's a legendary figure in the scene. Syafiqah's department, right? She's a new studies now, yeah. So he talked about the captive mind, where people, I'll send the paper to you. Is basically your entire mind is just, captured by these ideas, and you're not even aware of it, right? It's like fish in water. You don't know there's water. So a lot of times when we talk about it, we are just responding to debates happening overseas and trying to transpose it here, which is the problem of contextualization that Syafiqah was talking about. There's the English discourse, right? Now, the Mandarin discourse is captive more to China. So whatever racial language we have, language talk about race that comes from English will necessarily be challenged by the one that's coming in from China, because there's a global geopolitical thing at play, right? Which is why you have this Jewish conflation, and the Chinese community itself is so diverse, because you have the Chinese-speaking ones, and then you have the Anglicized ones, a lot of whom are influenced by the churches in the US. So it's a whole mess, right? And there's a lot of conflicting issues here. So we got to be very aware of, where these discussions are coming from. I've not come across any research that's, untangling it yet, but it's just something that we're only now recognizing. Yeah.
And that would be a great framework to kind of talk about Chinese privilege and the lack of understanding, right, between like the Zhao Bao group, right, and the whole Mandarin speaking group and the English speaking. So that is the context. That you have a master's thesis right there. So you have a master's thesis right there to talk about.
Come on, Suhaile.
and to understand like the PM's speech about there's no Chinese privilege in the National Day, right? So the fact that he can make such a claim, right, in a very confident way. Yeah, and to understand that. Yeah, and I guess for me the last word I want to kind of add in is that we used to emphasize the issue of tolerance, right? The culture of tolerance. We tolerate each other. We may not understand, but we tolerate. And there was, I think, some attempts to kind of move to more intercultural understanding of each other and so forth. But that is not going to be possible for everybody. And I think ultimately one comes down to a phrase that I kind of like, because it's starting to appear a lot in institutional contexts like NUS, because of the whole sexual misconduct issue. It's the culture of respect. We have to have respect for each other, and this can be also transposed, I think, from the issue of like the gender relations and whatnot into the questions of racial relations. A culture of respect in which we respect each other's space and views, and to be able to create those kind of safe spaces where we can talk, and deconstruct some of these more pernicious kind of racist stereotypes that can lead to detrimental kind of discrimination. Yeah.
So on that note, thank you so much, Syafiqah. Thank you so much, Suhaile, and thank you so much, Daniel, for being part of this. I and hopefully everyone else who's listening to this podcast will possibly have a better understanding of how to talk about racism and how to just understand it on a more, just try to figure it out in a better way than resorting to social media rhetoric, which is often, simplified and polarizing. So I think a good start would be to have a little more, a reasoned understanding of the situation. So, so on that note, I hope everybody enjoyed listening to this episode. If you have any feedback, please, reach out to me on socials, or, just send an email or on any of the social media pages. On that note, I would like to say goodbye. And once again, thank every one of the guests here. Daniel, Suhaile, Syafiqah, absolute pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
And thank you for having us as well.
Thank you for having me. It's a great conversation I had.
And for the rest of you listening, this was Coming Together. See ya.